to week 8. This screencast is just going to go over the process book instructions for this week, which are fairly simple. And then I thought it would be helpful to take a look at the peer feedback board from last week and just address some things that I saw coming up on there, some errors or things we want to get straightened out going forward. So this week is just the second phase of this project number 3, which is the type poster. And it's pretty straightforward. You're just going to be taking, so the sketches and comps you looked at last week, you're going to take your 3 best ones and put them in here. So by now these are no longer sketches, they're comps that are using the actual typeface that are done in Illustrator or InDesign on the computer. Put in your 3 top ones and then start looking at color variations. So for this one, you're just choosing one of these 3, bringing it down here and doing 4 color variations of it. So remember, with color, you're going to want high contrast. You want it to be legible, something that's eye-catching but not distracting either. And I believe it was 3 colors is what is required. Don't quote me on that. Go back to the project brief to make sure, but I believe it's 3 colors. So just do those variations. And then do the drawing letters and the type journal. So pretty easy, pretty straightforward. So let's go back and take a look at the discussion board from last week. So just flipping through here, I thought I would just kind of give my first thoughts and things on maybe some errors that I'm seeing that will want to be addressed in this week. It's a little bigger. So yeah, I'll just kind of scroll through this, and this isn't end-all be-all feedback. This is just kind of first impressions, things I'm seeing. This week I will go in on this week's process book for week 8 and give some more detailed feedback on everybody. But so for this first one, you make sure that you have all of the necessary parts. So you're going to need the actual name of the typeface. You're going to need the history paragraph. You'll also need the name of the type designer, the website you can buy it at, how much it costs. And I would say just make sure everything is legible. Here, some things maybe are starting to become a little bit illegible. It's not clear what exactly the name is in some of them. So just make sure that this is first and foremost a vehicle for conveying information. So we want it to be very clear, very easy to understand, easy to read. So I think across this whole selection, it seems like we are seeing all the parts, but they're not all coming together in one poster. So just run through that checklist again and make sure that you have all the necessary pieces. And I would say on all of these, make sure you have margins too. I've noticed that a lot scanning through, and we'll see it again, that we need margins around the edges. So right here, this would just get cut off. That price would get cut right off the bottom there. We need to make sure that it's okay to sometimes have elements bleed off the edge, like in these large letters. That's working okay. But when it comes down to small type, we want to make sure we have a good margin around the edge. Let's see. This one seems like all the elements are there. Again, legibility might be an issue in some of these ones that have some more layers. So while it could be interesting to make kind of a texture out of the type, you'll want to make sure that it's not distracting from the information in the poster. And if you're going to do something like this where the letters kind of form a pattern, I would make sure to type out, in addition to this, the name of the font, because while that looks interesting, we can't tell that the name is Clint. So if you're going to do something like that, then also just type out plain Clint so that we know the name of it. All right, let's see. So these ones have already started with color. It looks like this week you'll be using color even more, so it's okay that if you're just in black and white at this point. Let's see, these ones have some good white space going on here. I like that. The page isn't necessarily always full. It leaves some room, some nice white space to rest your eye, which is really nice. So I think there's some good ideas happening here. I would be careful not to use imagery like this little rocket ship. I think we want to keep this just strictly type-based. All right. Same thing on this one, we talked about the margins. So like this left margin here, all that text would just get cut right off. So make sure that you have good margins. I would be wary not to get too fancy like this one here as this little pyramidal kind of paragraph. When it's kind of a text heavy paragraph, usually you just want to stick to like a traditional square shape. There are exceptions to that, but it becomes very difficult to read when it's in a shape like that. So that would be my first thought. Let's see. All right, on this one, I would suggest maybe playing with using columns or other text alignments. So right now everything feels very horizontal, right? So we have a large horizontal paragraph and then the author and then the name. So everything is just kind of like these lines going across the page horizontally. So maybe try breaking it up with some columns or have things maybe not as symmetrical would help in a lot of these, I feel like. Again, margins, make sure we have margins so the type doesn't cut off the bottom. That's one thing that I feel like just really elevates, especially student design. It takes it from looking like student work to looking like professional work is when you make sure that things like margins and white space are used. It really makes a huge difference, and it's something that just comes with time and practice, but white space is your friend, and it's always good to have maybe a little bit more than you think, especially when it comes to margins. All right, this one has good margins. Yeah, I'd say these just need a little finessing, looking at things like relationship of where this paragraph is to the text, maybe a little more space in there. Making sure this has all the pieces too. Oh, it looks like they've got the price really small right there. So maybe you want to pull the price out of the main paragraph and make it feel like a little bit of a separate treatment. Let's see. All right, this one, I think on some of these, seems like the top row is a little better. On the bottom row, I'd say maybe less is more, pulling back on some of these elements. So where these letters start overlapping, it might become difficult to read. So I feel like this one, for example, it just said Bodoni, but we took out all those gray letters in the back, it would be more legible. Same with this one here. So yeah, don't be afraid when you're looking at your own work and critiquing, self-critiquing, to always think, is everything here necessary? Is there anything that's just decorative or is distracting from the meaning of the piece? It's something I do a lot, is what can I take out? What can I take away to make it more concise and more legible? All right. I think the same thing with this one is that there's a lot going on, and what can we remove to simplify it? Remove, or this one I think lacks a grid. So for all of these, you should start every design project with an underlying grid, and then you can start snapping pieces to the grid. So right now, see, we have lines that are all over the place. So we have horizontal lines that go here, but then this paragraph starts here. Like right here, we have this stair step going on. So this isn't really snapped to a grid. So I feel like all of these elements, if they were pulled back a little bit, simplified, and then used a grid structure to align them. As a general recommendation, center alignment, such as in this one, is more difficult to read for legibility's sake. So usually you want to save center aligning text for just short pieces of text, like a headline, but usually body copy or large paragraphs you will want to justify or left align, not center align. So I would recommend doing that here and here. Again, we talked about earlier kind of oddly shaped paragraphs. This one where the paragraph is on an angle is going to be really difficult to read. So I'd recommend just straightening that out. It's okay to have one letter maybe on a diagonal that adds some dimension and movement, but I wouldn't do a block of text on a diagonal. And make sure you're using the class font pack, and also in terms of styles. So right here we have this condensed going on, and maybe that is the condensed face of Baskerville, but I don't think we use that in the class. More likely the student just kind of squished it. which, if you haven't learned by now from reading my critique, is one of my pet peeves, and I think is a good thing to learn early on in typography, is that you never distort type. So I hope none of you feel like I'm picking on you here. Thank you for providing all these wonderful examples, and we're all going to learn this together, and nobody is perfect in this, but the rule of thumb, you never want to distort type. Never squish, squeeze, pull, extend, rotate. Don't ever do that. Just leave it right as it comes out of the cursor. If you need it extended, then choose an extended face. Don't just drag it outward, because people will be able to tell. And it will help elevate your work if you don't do that. So we see it here. This one looks a little extended. This one as well. I think to my eye, it's even more obvious. So just always make sure to not distort your type. It ruins the integrity of the typeface. It's not how the designer intended it to be. The proportions will be off. So yeah, just a rule of thumb, and good to learn it here in this class before heading out to the real world. All right, this one could use some more margins like we talked about earlier. I think some of the feedback from before applies to this. I would be careful what you choose to emphasize. So, for example, this one makes the title Bodoni almost illegible because of these two O's have been enlarged and emphasized. So that's obviously where my eye goes first, is OO, and not reading this as a cohesive Bodoni. So if you choose to pull out a letter, like down here, I think it's done a little bit better, as a decorative element, but still have the title intact and legible. Another rule of thumb, generally in design, you don't track out lowercase letters. And all of these things that I'm talking about in the beginning of class, I think the second or third week, I posted a little typography cheat sheet in my announcements. So hopefully all of you downloaded that and looked at it, and it kind of talks about all of these little just do's and don'ts that you pick up over time. One of them, don't track out lowercase letters. All right, this one, again, margins. You can see that it's already getting cut off there at the bottom. Also, I feel like the leading is a little bit large in here. Generally, you want the leading to be about 1 point larger than the type. So if you have the type is size 11, try leading at size 12. That's like a good rule of thumb of where to start, 11 over 12 or 9 over 10. And that'll put you at a good starting point. So I think, yeah, this one could be a little less, maybe this one too. Also, always turn off your hyphenation. So I forgot to mention this earlier. I saw it on some that we've passed over. Just check the box that says no hyphenation. You almost never want to use hyphenation unless you're working in a newspaper or something like that kind of industry. But for this purpose, just turn it off. It makes the words look choppy, and we don't need it. Right. These ones are looking pretty good. I'd say on some of them, again, just maybe learning when to pull back a little bit. This one's got a lot of things going on. Generally, if you're you kind of have to have one thing that stands out. So if you're going to do Avenir and kind of this bouncing text, then maybe it's a little bit too much to have this pattern going on behind it as well. So maybe this poster just needs one or the other. Same here, if you're going to do this big extended N, is it necessary to have the pattern again? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe it just needs to be toned back a little bit, a little more grayed out so it's easier to read. So just think about things like that you don't need to have all of the ideas in one poster. Maybe just one thing that makes it stand out, but not everything. Again, here, margins on the bottom, looking a little tight. And some of the other things we talked about with center alignment, more white space between the columns. All right, this is a little tiny. I would say same thing as above, just learning when to pull back a little bit. Margins, this one definitely needs some margins around the edge. Feedback. All right, this one again, margins. This type might be feeling a little big. With posters, you kind of want to think of it viewing a poster at different levels. So if you're standing 20 feet away, what do you see 10 feet away, 2 feet away, right up close. So at the 20-foot distance, you would probably want to be able to see the headline, the largest thing on there. And maybe at the 10-foot distance, you see the font designer and the date. And then when you get closer at 2 feet, maybe that's when you start to read the type with the history. And then at 1 foot, that would be like small print at the bottom, like little fine print kind of things. So if you think about a poster that way, you kind of see what your sizes need to be. So obviously the biggest thing is the name. And if you are expecting people to only be able to read this history paragraph at a foot away, then it only needs to be like 10 to 12 point font, as if you were reading a book. So that's a good guide to use, I would say, for these posters, is just make the history part, this text heavy part, about the size as you would for a book, which is about 10 or 11 point. All right. Let's say the same for this one about blocks of type in shapes. Shapes are okay in certain circumstances, but if you are setting a large block of type, I would just keep it to a square and stay away from these fancy shapes because it'll make it very difficult to read. But I do like the use of white space here. There's some good white space going on. Again, the margins, this will get cut right off on the side, so make sure to bring that in a little. All right. Let's say same thing on these ones, just pulling back a little bit and having just one piece that stands out on each of them. Just feels like there's a lot going on here right now. So just say simplifying a bit. I think what else? Margins again. Turning off the hyphenation. I think these just need a little bit more white space, some of them. So, for instance, taking this text block here, samples, and shrinking it down might help so that it's just small in the center there. I would also consider, since this is about typefaces, if it's necessary to have decoration. Like these circles aren't particularly adding anything to the typeface. They're not helping to differentiate information. They're not emphasizing anything. They're just kind of purely decoration, so they might not be necessary. Whereas this kind of decoration serves a little bit more of a purpose, right? It's creating a frame to house this block of text in. Seems a little more intentional. Getting to the end here. All right, this one, again with the margins, a block of text like this, I think I'd always left align or center align, not right align. I think some of these could use a little bit more white space in them, like these last two, but I think these are off to a good start. Just margins, white space, kind of at the point where we're finessing all the details now. On this one, I think if we want to talk about hierarchy, that maybe Egyptian slate should be the darkest thing on the page, and then this S could have the light gray in the background so that your eye will first be drawn to that. All right, and we've hit the end here. So hopefully that was helpful to just kind of see my first impressions going through all of these. Hopefully you picked up some tips, maybe as I discussed your own or some of your classmates, that will help you as you move along this week and start designing. I'd like to hear if you felt like this was helpful, if this was more helpful for me going over everyone's work in a video form rather than just leaving my comments on each one as I've done in the past. Just be curious to know which is more helpful for you in terms of feedback. So yeah, hopefully that was good. And you can always email me if you'd like more detailed feedback or have more questions, and I'll be happy to help. Have a great week.